The rhythmic hum of the airport was familiar to General Ayanna Brooks. She had been in and out of terminals more times than she could count. Yet today, something felt different. Maybe it was the subtle stares, curious glances cast in her direction as she made her way to the first-class lounge. Or perhaps it was the weight of the upcoming meeting looming over her, a meeting that could alter the course of national security. But as she handed her ticket to the gate agent, a thought crossed her mind. Why do people still look at me as if I don't belong here? "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant said, eyeing her uniform. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Ayanna's gaze flickered to the empty first-class seat she was about to take. She'd faced challenges on the battlefield, led troops into hostile territories, but here, on a commercial flight, she was battling something entirely different. Was this going to be one of those moments? How many times had she been underestimated? How many times had people assumed she was less than what she truly was? The question lingered in her mind as the flight attendant's voice cut through her thoughts. What happens next, you might wonder? Does she raise her voice? Does she demand respect? Or does she let the moment pass, knowing that true power doesn't always need to be asserted? Ayanna's response, however, would not just change the course of this flight, it would echo far beyond the confines of this cabin. The bright afternoon sun filtered through the airport's massive windows, casting long shadows across the bustling terminal. General Ayanna Brooks moved with purpose through the crowd, her boots clicking against the polished floor. Dressed in her pristine military uniform, adorned with medals and insignias, she exuded authority and composure. Her sharp eyes took in the surroundings, noting the occasional double-take from passers-by who spotted her, some with curiosity, others with subtle discomfort. She had learned long ago to tune out those looks, though they still bothered her on occasion. The first-class lounge stood ahead, and Ayanna approached the gate with her boarding pass in hand. She was on her way to Washington, D.C., for a high-level military briefing, an urgent meeting concerning national security. It wasn't unusual for her to travel like this. In fact, her schedule was often packed with flights, briefings, and high-stakes decisions. But today, something felt slightly off. As she neared the gate, a flight attendant, a tall man with neatly combed hair and a crisp uniform, glanced at her and frowned. His eyes scanned her up and down in a way that made her feel as though she didn't belong. His name tag read Nathan.
Oh.
"Good afternoon," Ayanna said calmly as she handed him her boarding pass. Nathan hesitated, his eyes lingering on her uniform for a moment too long. He cleared his throat, his demeanor cold and unwelcoming. "Ma'am, are you sure this is the right boarding pass?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Ayanna raised an eyebrow. "I'm fairly certain," she replied, her voice calm but firm. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone, least of all this flight attendant, but there was something in his tone that irked her. Nathan stared at the boarding pass for a moment as if trying to find an error. When he failed to do so, he handed it back with a strained smile. "Right this way," he said, motioning toward the entrance of the plane. As Ayanna made her way onto the plane, she could feel the stares of other passengers. She wasn't unfamiliar with the experience. Being a black woman in a position of power often invited curiosity, sometimes skepticism, and too often outright prejudice. But she had learned to carry herself with grace, never letting anyone see if their looks bothered her. The flight was only half full. First-class passengers were already settling in. Men in suits, women in designer clothes, sipping on complimentary champagne. Ayanna found her seat near the front of the cabin. She placed her small duffel in the overhead compartment and sat down, grateful for a moment of quiet before what was bound to be an intense series of meetings. Just as she was about to relax, Nathan appeared again, this time standing over her seat with an air of authority that seemed entirely out of place. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask to see your boarding pass again," he said, his voice more insistent now. Ayanna looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I've already shown it to you," she replied, her voice steady. "I understand that," Nathan said, his tone growing sharper. "But we've had some issues with seating arrangements today, and I need to make sure everything is in order." The other passengers in first class were watching now, some pretending not to notice, while others openly stared at the interaction. Ayana could feel the tension building, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. She wasn't supposed to be here. That's what Nathan was implying. With a sigh, Ayana reached into her pocket and pulled out her boarding pass again, handing it to Nathan. He inspected it closely, his eyes narrowing as if looking for a reason to deny her the seat she had rightfully paid for. "You know, if you have any doubts about my place here, you can call your superiors," Ayana said quietly. Her voice carried a hint of steel beneath the calm surface. "I'm sure they'll be able to confirm that I belong exactly where I am." Nathan flushed, his grip on the boarding pass tightening. He handed it back without a word and turned on his heel, disappearing down the aisle. Ayana sighed, settling back into her seat. It wasn't the first time she had been questioned, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But today, of all days, she had hoped for a peaceful flight. She had far bigger issues to deal with than the fragile ego of a flight attendant who couldn't seem to wrap his mind around the idea that someone like her could belong in first class. The seat beside her remained empty, and Ayana was grateful for the solitude. She closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind and focus on the briefing ahead. The military meeting was of utmost importance, a matter of national security, with high-ranking officials from around the world expected to attend. She had been preparing for weeks, reviewing intelligence reports and contingency plans, but the weight of responsibility still pressed heavily on her shoulders. As the plane began to fill up, Nathan made another pass through the cabin, avoiding eye contact with Ayana. She watched him from the corner of her eye, noting the stiffness in his movements, the tightness of his jaw. He was clearly uncomfortable, but whether it was because of his earlier behavior or because of her presence, she couldn't tell. When the plane was finally ready for takeoff, Ayana let out a slow breath. She leaned her head back against the seat, feeling the gentle hum of the engines beneath her. It was a feeling she had grown accustomed to over the years. The anticipation of leaving the ground, the brief moment of weightlessness before the plane leveled out. But today, that familiar feeling was tainted by the incident with Nathan. It shouldn't have bothered her, but it did. As the plane ascended, Ayana's thoughts drifted to the upcoming meeting. The briefing was centered on a critical situation involving potential international conflict. Her role as a general in the U.S. military meant she had to be at the forefront of strategic discussions, providing insight and leadership. There were lives at stake, and every decision made in that room could have far-reaching consequences. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Ayana glanced around the cabin before discreetly pulling out her encrypted military phone. The message was short and to the point. Urgent. Briefing materials have been updated. Prepare for additional intelligence reports upon arrival. She frowned, tucking the phone away. More changes. More pressure. But that was the nature of her work. Constantly adapting. Constantly strategizing. She had built her career on her ability to stay calm under pressure. To lead with both intelligence and empathy. But moments like these, when she was questioned simply because of how she looked, reminded her of the battles she fought outside the war room. A quiet voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Ayana turned to see a young woman, a soldier, standing beside her seat. She was wearing an economy-class uniform, her posture stiff with respect and awe. "I just wanted to say, it's an honor to see someone like you in uniform," the young soldier said, her voice filled with admiration. "You're an inspiration to all of us." Ayana smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I appreciate that." The young soldier nodded and quickly returned to her seat, leaving Ayana to her thoughts once again. It was moments like this that reminded her why she did what she did, why she fought, why she led, why she never let the stares and doubts get to her. It wasn't just about her, it was about every soldier, every woman, every person who saw her and realized that they too could break barriers, that they too could lead. The plane leveled out, and Ayana leaned her head back once more, her mind drifting between the upcoming briefing and the fleeting encounters that had marked the start of her journey. The flight attendant's judgment had been just another reminder of the long road ahead. but she knew that she had faced far worse, and she would face far worse in the days to come. But she was ready. She had always been ready, and no flight attendant or anyone else was going to stop her. The hum of the engines and the rhythmic bustle of the flight crew provided a steady background to General Ayanna Brooks' inner thoughts as the plane continued to climb toward cruising altitude. She stared out of the small window, watching the clouds drift by, but her mind was far from the serenity of the sky. The interaction with Nathan, the flight attendant, still lingered. His attitude wasn't new to her. She had dealt with it all her life, but it never failed to sting. She had long ago learned to wear a mask of calm and control, especially in situations like this. But even generals, no matter how composed, were human. The seatbelt light blinked off, and passengers began to move about the cabin. Ayanna reached into her bag, pulling out a folder with military documents. She flipped through the pages, skimming the briefing materials for the meeting ahead. But the words blurred in her vision as her mind kept returning to the earlier confrontation. Why did moments like these still happen? Why did people still assume that because of the color of her skin or the fact that she was a woman, she couldn't possibly hold a position of power? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She looked up to see Nathan approaching her again, his face tight with discomfort. She could tell by his hesitant gait that he was trying to muster the courage to speak. "Ma'am?" His voice faltered as he stood by her seat, glancing nervously at the passengers around him. I wanted to apologize for earlier." Ayanna folded the documents in her lap, keeping her expression neutral. "For what exactly?" she asked, her voice steady but pointed. She wasn't going to let him off the hook easily. If there was one thing she had learned in her years of leading soldiers, it was that accountability mattered. Nathan shifted uncomfortably, clearly thrown off by her question. "For questioning your seat," he stammered. "I didn't mean to assume. Well, I thought there was a mistake, and what made you think that?" Ayanna asked, her tone sharper now. Her eyes locked onto his, unflinching. Nathan's face flushed. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, clearly grappling with his words. Ayanna had seen this hesitation before. The internal struggle of someone realizing their prejudice had been exposed, laid bare in front of the very person they had wronged. "I don't know," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It just didn't seem right. I guess You didn't think I belonged here," Ayanna finished for him. Her voice wasn't angry, but it was firm, grounded in the reality of what she knew to be true. "You saw a black woman in a first-class seat and assumed something was off." Nathan's shoulders sagged, and he nodded, shame flooding his face. "I'm really sorry, ma'am. It wasn't my place to judge. I didn't mean to offend." Ayanna studied him for a moment, considering her next words carefully. She wasn't the type to humiliate someone for their mistakes, but she also knew this was an opportunity for a lesson. Too often, people like Nathan went through life unchecked, their biases left unchallenged. She wasn't going to let that happen today. "Do you know what I do, Nathan?" she asked, her voice calm but commanding. He shook his head, swallowing nervously. "I'm a general in the United States Army," she said, her eyes still locked onto his. "I've led troops in combat zones. I've made decisions that affect the lives of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. I've sat in rooms with world leaders, advising them on matters of national security. And yet, when you looked at me today, all you saw was someone who didn't belong." Nathan blinked, his expression a mixture of shock and regret. He glanced around, realizing that the other passengers were watching now, their interest piqued by the conversation. His discomfort was palpable, but Ayanna pressed on. "Do you know how many times I've been questioned? How many times I've been underestimated because of the way I look?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. "I've lost count, and every time it happens, I remind myself that I am more than the assumptions people make about me." Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked as though he wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor of the plane and escape the weight of Ayanna's words. "I don't need your apology," Ayanna continued, her tone softening slightly. "What I need is for you to learn from this. The next time you see someone who doesn't fit into your preconceived notions of what success or power looks like, don't make assumptions. You never know who that person might be. Nathan nodded, his eyes downcast. I understand, ma'am. I really do. I'll be better. Oh. Ayana gave him a long, appraising look before nodding. Good. Now, I'd appreciate it if you could bring me a glass of water. No need for anything else. Nathan nodded quickly, eager to make amends in whatever way he could. He hurried off toward the galley, leaving Ayana alone once more. The other passengers were still watching, but Ayana paid them no mind. She had said what needed to be said, and that was enough. She returned to her documents, flipping through the pages as if nothing had happened. But inside, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of frustration. How many more times would she have to prove herself, explain herself, justify her existence in spaces that should have welcomed her without question? A few minutes later, Nathan returned with a glass of water, setting it down carefully on her tray. He gave her a tentative smile before retreating to the galley, clearly trying to stay out of her way for the rest of the flight. Ayana took a sip of the water, her mind drifting to her journey. How far she had come, and how many battles she had fought, both on and off the battlefield. The memories came unbidden, a montage of moments flashing through her mind. Flashback. It was her first deployment overseas, a combat zone in the Middle East. She was a young officer back then, full of ambition and determination. But the challenges she faced weren't just from the enemy. Her own peers questioned her capabilities, not because of her rank or skills, but because of her race and gender. She remembered a particularly difficult mission, leading a convoy through a volatile region. There had been doubts about her ability to command under pressure. Some of her colleagues, mostly older, white men, had subtly questioned her decisions, second-guessed her orders. They didn't say it outright, but the undertone was clear. They didn't trust her. But Ayana had proven them wrong. The mission had been a success, her leadership decisive and strategic. She had earned their respect that day, not just for her tactical mind, but for her resilience. It was a hard-fought victory, one that came at the cost of having to constantly defend her right to lead. Present day. The flight continued, the tension in the cabin slowly easing as the passengers settled into the routine of air travel. But Ayana's mind was still on that flashback, on the countless times she had faced prejudice, both overt and subtle. She had grown used to it, but that didn't mean it didn't sting every time it happened. A quiet voice interrupted her thoughts again. It was the young soldier from economy class, the same one who had spoken to her earlier. "Ma'am," the soldier said, standing respectfully by Ayana's seat. "I just wanted to thank you for what you said back there. I've dealt with that kind of thing too, and it means a lot to see someone like you standing up for yourself. And for all of us." Ayana smiled, the tension in her chest easing slightly. "Thank you," she replied. "It's not always easy, but it's necessary. We have to hold people accountable, and we have to remind ourselves of our worth, no matter what anyone else thinks." The soldier nodded, her admiration clear in her eyes. "I hope I can be as strong as you one day." "Oh, you already are," Ayana said softly. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The soldier smiled, her confidence bolstered by Ayana's words. She gave a quick salute before returning to her seat, leaving Ayana alone once more. As the flight progressed, Ayana continued to review her documents, her mind shifting back to the upcoming briefing. The stakes were high, and the decisions made in that room could have far-reaching consequences. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, knowing that the battles she fought outside the war room were just as important as those within it. She had learned long ago that leadership wasn't just about commanding troops or making strategic decisions. It was about standing up for what was right, even in the face of prejudice and doubt. It was about showing strength, not just in battle, but in the everyday interactions that shaped how people saw the world and how they saw each other. Ayana closed her eyes, letting the steady hum of the plane lull her into a state of calm. She knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more moments where she would have to prove herself to those who doubted her. But she was ready. She had always been ready. And nothing, No flight attendant, no stranger's assumptions could take that away from her. As the flight settled into its cruising altitude, the cabin dimmed slightly, and the faint hum of the engines lulled most of the passengers into a quiet relaxation. General Ayanna Brooks shifted in her seat, still keenly aware of the earlier confrontation. The tension from her exchange with Nathan lingered, but there was no time to dwell on it. There was a far more pressing matter at hand, an urgent military briefing waiting for her in Washington. Her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. She glanced around, ensuring that the other passengers were not paying attention, and discreetly pulled out her secure military phone. The encrypted message on the screen made her sit up a little straighter. Urgent. Additional intelligence received. Situation developing. Prepare for new briefing materials upon arrival. Ayanna's pulse quickened. The weight of responsibility that had been pressing on her shoulders since the moment she boarded the plane felt heavier now. Her mind immediately shifted into strategic mode, analyzing the situation from every angle. She couldn't afford to miss a single detail. Whatever was happening, it had escalated since she last reviewed the intelligence reports. She exhaled slowly, folding her hands in her lap. Years of military training had taught her how to manage stress under pressure. Even in the middle of a crisis, her mind remained sharp, focused. But there was something about this particular mission that felt different. The urgency of the messages, the sudden changes in the briefing materials, it all hinted at a situation more volatile than usual. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of soft footsteps approaching. She looked up to see Nathan, the flight attendant, hovering nervously by her seat. His earlier bravado had completely dissolved. Now he seemed unsure of himself, his eyes darting between Ayanna and the passengers around her. "Ma'am, I just wanted to see if you needed anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ayanna regarded him for a moment, her expression neutral. She could see the discomfort in his posture, the way he avoided direct eye contact. It was clear that he had realized the gravity of his earlier behavior, but Ayanna wasn't in the mood to offer any more lessons. She had a job to do, and right now, that was her primary focus. "No, thank you," she said simply, turning her attention back to the folder of documents in her lap. Nathan lingered for a moment longer, as if hoping for some form of acknowledgement or forgiveness. But when none came, he nodded awkwardly and retreated to the galley. Ayanna's eyes flickered back to her phone. The message still glowed on the screen, a stark reminder of the high-stakes meeting she was about to walk into. She needed to focus. There was no room for distractions. But just as she was about to delve back into the briefing materials, a voice from behind her caught her attention. "Ma'am?" Ayanna turned to see a young man in uniform, another soldier, standing at the edge of the aisle. His uniform was less decorated than hers, and from his posture and the way he held himself, she could tell he was still early in his military career. He looked nervous, fidgeting slightly as he stood by her seat. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, "but I just wanted to say, it's an honor to be on the same flight as you. I've read about your work, and you've been a real inspiration to soldiers like me." "Oh." Ayanna smiled softly, nodding at the young soldier. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm. "I appreciate that." The soldier shifted nervously. "I hope one day I can serve under a commander like you." You will," Ayanna replied confidently. "Just keep working hard, stay focused, and never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. Trust in your abilities." The young soldier's eyes brightened at her words. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot coming from you." With a respectful nod, the soldier returned to his seat, leaving Ayanna alone with her thoughts once again. She watched him for a moment, reflecting on her own journey through the ranks. There had been countless moments of doubt, times when she had questioned whether she had the strength to overcome the obstacles in her path. But she had always persevered, driven by her unwavering commitment to her country and her determination to prove herself as a leader. Ayanna's phone buzzed again, pulling her back to the present. Another encrypted message had come through, this time with more detailed instructions. She quickly scanned the text, her mind racing as she processed the new information. The situation was escalating faster than anticipated. The intelligence reports indicated a potential threat on the horizon, one that could have serious implications for national security if not handled correctly. Ayana's role in the upcoming meeting would be crucial, and she knew that every decision she made would carry immense weight. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a brief moment to center herself. This was the part of her job that no one saw. The quiet moments of contemplation before a major decision. The internal calculations that shaped her every move. It wasn't just about leading troops into battle or making tactical decisions in the heat of the moment. It was about the quiet, deliberate planning that happened behind the scenes. The careful consideration of every possible outcome, every potential risk. For a brief moment, her mind flashed back to her early days in the military, when she had been a young officer, much like the soldier who had just spoken to her. She had been eager, determined, but also unsure of herself. There had been moments when she had felt like she didn't belong, when the weight of the expectations placed on her shoulders had seemed too much to bear. But she had pushed through. She had risen through the ranks, proving herself time and time again, until she had earned the respect of her peers and the trust of her superiors. And now, here she was, on the verge of leading a critical briefing that could shape the future of national security. The plane continued to cruise through the sky, but Ayana's mind was already on the ground, in that meeting room where decisions of consequence would be made. She opened her eyes, her expression resolute. She knew what needed to be done. The hours passed slowly as Ayana reviewed the latest intelligence reports, analyzing every detail, considering every angle. The flight attendant came by occasionally to offer refreshments, but Ayana waved them off, her focus entirely on the task at hand. As the plane began its descent into Washington, D.C., Ayana closed the folder of documents and tucked it neatly into her bag. Her phone buzzed again, this time a final update from the team waiting for her at the base. The briefing was ready, and her presence was required immediately upon landing. Ayana adjusted her uniform, smoothing out any wrinkles and ensuring that her medals and insignias were perfectly aligned. There would be no room for hesitation once she stepped off this plane. The moment her boots touched the ground, she would be thrust into a high-stakes environment where every second mattered. The landing was smooth, and as the plane taxied toward the gate, Ayana mentally prepared herself for what was to come. She could already see the military convoy waiting for her on the tarmac, a stark reminder of the seriousness of the situation. The plane came to a stop, and as the other passengers began to gather their belongings, Ayana stood up, her movements measured and deliberate. She grabbed her duffel bag from the overhead compartment and slung it over her shoulder. Nathan, the flight attendant, appeared one final time as she prepared to disembark. His expression was a mixture of regret and respect, and he opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Ayana didn't wait for him to find his voice. She nodded curtly and made her way toward the front of the plane. As she stepped out of the aircraft, the warm air of Washington greeted her, along with the sight of uniformed military personnel waiting to escort her. Their salutes were sharp, their expressions serious. Ayana returned their salutes with the same precision, her face calm and composed. "General Brooks," one of the officers said, stepping forward, "we're ready for you. The briefing is set to begin as soon as we arrive at the base." Let's move," Ayana replied, her tone commanding but steady. The convoy of vehicles waited just beyond the terminal, engines idling as they prepared to transport her to the base. Ayana climbed into the lead vehicle, her mind already racing through the scenarios she had prepared for. There was no room for error, not now, not with the stakes this high. As the convoy pulled away from the airport and sped toward the military base, Ayana allowed herself a brief moment to reflect on the events of the flight. It had been a minor confrontation in the grand scheme of things, but it had served as a reminder of the challenges she faced, not just as a general, but as a black woman in a position of power. But as the city streets blurred by, Ayana pushed those thoughts aside. There was no time for reflection now. The meeting ahead demanded her full attention, and she was ready to lead, just as she had always been. As the convoy sped away from the airport, General Ayana Brooks leaned back in her seat, her mind laser-focused on the mission ahead. She had quickly shifted gears from the tension on the flight to the critical briefing she was about to lead. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she had grown accustomed to that feeling. It was part of the job, part of being a leader at her level. But for Nathan, the flight attendant she had left behind in the cabin, things were quite different. On the plane, Nathan stood at the front of the cabin, watching as the last few passengers disembarked. He felt a knot of guilt tightening in his chest. The confrontation with General Brooks. He hadn't been able to get it out of his mind since it happened. When she had calmly explained who she was and what she had accomplished, it was like a punch to the gut. How had he been so blind? How had he allowed his own biases to make assumptions about her? He couldn't even explain why he had reacted the way he did, only that it had been automatic. As he watched General Brooks walk off the plane with that quiet but commanding presence, Nathan felt something shift inside him. He had seen powerful people before. He'd served first-class passengers who were CEOs, celebrities, and politicians. But there was something different about her. It wasn't just her rank or the medals on her uniform. It was the way she carried herself, the way she spoke with authority, yet didn't feel the need to flaunt her power. And he had disrespected her. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair, now slightly tousled from the stress of the flight. He wished he could go back and redo that moment, but the damage had already been done. The other flight attendants moved through the cabin, cleaning up after the passengers. Nathan, however, remained still, lost in thought. He replayed the interaction over and over in his mind, cringing at how he had behaved. He had let his biases guide his actions, and it had led him to insult a person who had more dignity and grace than anyone he had ever met. One of his colleagues, a young woman named Sarah, approached him with a curious look. "Hey, you okay? You've been pretty quiet since that whole thing with the general." Nathan sighed again and leaned against the wall of the galley. "I messed up, Sarah. I made some assumptions about her, just because of the way she looks, and she called me out on it." Sarah frowned, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I saw what happened. It didn't look good. But hey, at least you tried to apologize, right?" "I did, but it wasn't enough," Nathan admitted. "She was calm, respectful, even after I treated her like she didn't belong. She didn't raise her voice or demand anything. She just told me to do better. And now I can't stop thinking about it." "Bull." Sarah glanced around, making sure no passengers were within earshot. "Well, maybe this is a lesson you needed to learn. We've all had moments where we let our biases get the better of us. The important thing is what you do next." Nathan looked at her, feeling a flicker of hope. "You're right. I can't change what happened, but I can make sure I don't do it again. I need to be better than that." Back at the airport, after the passengers had all disembarked, Nathan made his way through the empty cabin, helping with the final cleanup before the crew could disband. His thoughts were still clouded with guilt, but there was a new sense of determination growing within him. He couldn't let this experience go to waste. He needed to take responsibility for his actions and learn from his mistakes. As he exited the plane and walked through the terminal, Nathan felt the urge to talk to someone who could offer guidance. His mind wandered to a mentor he had met early in his career, a retired flight captain who had always stressed the importance of treating every passenger with dignity, no matter who they were or where they came from. Maybe it was time to seek his advice again. Nathan pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Captain Peterson, asking if they could meet for coffee later that week. He needed to talk this through with someone who could give him perspective. He didn't want this moment to become just another regret. As he made his way to the crew lounge, Nathan found himself reflecting on the subtle ways prejudice and bias could creep into everyday interactions. He had never considered himself a prejudiced person, but this incident had forced him to confront a truth he hadn't wanted to face. He had biases, and they had influenced his actions, whether he had intended them to or not. A few days later, Nathan sat in a small cafe, nursing a cup of black coffee. Across from him sat Captain Peterson, the older man's sharp blue eyes studying Nathan with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "So, tell me what happened," Captain Peterson said, his voice calm but direct. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I made a big mistake on my last flight. I assumed something about a passenger. And it wasn't just any passenger. She was a general. General Ayanna Brooks, one of the highest-ranking officers in the Army. And I treated her like she didn't belong in first class. Captain Peterson raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting Nathan continue. I didn't think about what I was doing at the time. I saw her uniform, and I just made an assumption. I thought she didn't belong in first class, and I acted on that assumption. She called me out on it, and I apologized, but it still doesn't feel like enough. Captain Peterson leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You know, Nathan, we've all made mistakes like that. It's not uncommon to have biases. Everyone does. The important thing is recognizing them and doing something about it. Nathan nodded, feeling a mix of relief and shame. Yeah, I get that now. I feel like I let her down. I let myself down. But you're holding yourself accountable, and that's a good first step, Captain Peterson said. But accountability means more than just feeling bad about it. What are you going to do next? Nathan thought about it for a moment. I want to be more aware. I don't want to make snap judgments like that again. I've been reading about unconscious bias, and I want to start making an effort to treat every passenger with the respect they deserve, regardless of what they look like or what assumptions I might have. Oh, that's a good start, Captain Peterson said, nodding. And you should know, General Brooks didn't react the way she did because she wanted to humiliate you. She wanted you to learn. She gave you the opportunity to reflect and grow, and that's a gift. Don't waste it. Oh, Nathan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Captain Peterson was right. General Brooks had shown him grace, even when she had every right to be angry. She hadn't lashed out or made a scene. Instead, she had calmly pointed out his mistake and given him the chance to learn from it. I won't waste it, Nathan said, his voice filled with quiet determination. I'm going to do better. Captain Peterson smiled and took a sip of his coffee. Good. That's all anyone can ask for. We're all human, Nathan. We all make mistakes. The difference between a good person and a great one is whether or not they learn from those mistakes. Back at work, a week later, Nathan was back on a flight, this time determined to approach his job with a new mindset. He moved through the cabin with more awareness, making an effort to greet each passenger with the same level of respect, regardless of their appearance or background. As he handed out drinks and assisted passengers, he thought about General Brooks and the way she had carried herself during their confrontation. He admired her poise, her strength, and her ability to turn a difficult situation into a teaching moment. It was a lesson he wouldn't forget. By the time the plane touched down, Nathan felt a sense of accomplishment. He had taken the first steps toward becoming the person he wanted to be. A flight attendant who treated everyone with dignity and respect, no matter who they were. As he gathered his things and prepared to disembark, Nathan glanced out the window, watching the passengers leave the plane. He didn't know if he would ever see General Brooks again, but he hoped that, wherever she was, she knew the impact she had made on him. He had been humbled by the experience, but he had also been given a second chance. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. The convoy carrying General Ayanna Brooks sped along the wide streets of Washington, D.C., a sense of urgency palpable in the air. As they approached the military base, the city skyline gave way to more secure and classified surroundings. Ayanna's mind was laser-focused, fully shifted away from the uncomfortable flight to the critical situation at hand. Her brief moments of reflection were over, and now it was time to lead. The vehicles stopped outside the secure gates of the military base. Ayanna stepped out, adjusting her uniform. A team of officers and aides were already waiting for her at the entrance, their salutes crisp and precise. They knew the gravity of the situation, just as she did. General Brooks, an officer said, stepping forward to meet her. The briefing room is ready. The latest intelligence has been uploaded to your secure network. Ayanna nodded, acknowledging the officer with a quick salute before moving swiftly toward the command center. Her expression remained composed, but her mind was working at high speed, assessing and preparing for the upcoming discussions. The corridors of the base were filled with military personnel moving with purpose. Some glanced at Ayanna as she passed by, recognizing the significance of her presence. She had built a reputation over the years as a decisive and strategic leader, one who didn't back down from challenges and always kept her cool under pressure. That reputation had earned her respect from her peers and subordinates alike. And it was why she was here today, about to lead a briefing that could determine the future of national security. As she entered the briefing room, Ayanna was greeted by a group of high-ranking officials and military advisors, already seated around a large table. Screens lined the walls, displaying live intelligence feeds from various sources around the world. The atmosphere was tense, but Ayanna's presence brought a sense of order and direction. She took her seat at the head of the table, immediately diving into the situation at hand. "Let's get started," she said, her voice steady but commanding. One of the intelligence officers stood up, bringing up the first set of images on the screen. "General, we've received new intel from our sources overseas. The situation has escalated. We believe there may be a coordinated effort to disrupt key military operations in multiple regions." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the gravity of the situation. Ayanna's eyes remained fixed on the screen, taking in the details. This was what she had been preparing for, what the encrypted messages had hinted at during her flight. The stakes were high, and every decision made in this room would have far-reaching consequences. "Do we have confirmation of their capabilities?" Ayanna asked, her tone sharp and precise. The intelligence officer nodded. "Yes, ma'am. We've intercepted communications suggesting that the group responsible has access to advanced technology and weaponry. If they're successful, they could severely undermine our strategic positions." Ayanna leaned back in her chair, her mind racing through potential responses. "We need to act fast," she said. "Our forces in those regions need to be prepared for immediate mobilization. I want a full assessment of their readiness by the end of the hour." Another officer spoke up. "General, we've already begun preparations, but we'll need authorization for some of the more classified maneuvers." "You'll have it," Ayanna responded without hesitation. "I'll sign off on any necessary actions, but we need to ensure that our movements are coordinated across all branches. No one goes into this blind." The room was a hive of activity as the officers began to outline their strategies. Ayanna listened carefully, offering input where necessary, but mostly allowing her team to handle the details. She had chosen these people for their expertise and trustworthiness, and now was the time to let them do their jobs. As the discussion continued, Ayanna's phone buzzed once again. She glanced at it, quickly reading the message from her personal aide. "President's office requesting immediate update." She let out a small breath, knowing the importance of keeping the political leaders informed without alarming them unnecessarily. It was a delicate balance, providing enough information to keep them confident in the military's ability to handle the situation, while also ensuring that they didn't overreact and complicate things further. "Keep the briefing going," Ayanna said to her team. "I'll step out for a moment." She left the room and made her way down the corridor to a secure communications room where she could speak with the president's office directly. As she entered the room, a secure video link was already set up, and the face of the president's chief of staff appeared on the screen. "General Brooks," the chief of staff began, "we've been briefed on the situation, but the president is requesting a personal update on where things stand." "Bull!" Ayanna nodded. "We've received confirmation that the threat is credible. Our intelligence indicates a coordinated attack aimed at destabilizing our military operations in key regions. I've already mobilized our forces and am working with my team to assess our readiness across all branches. We're moving quickly, but we have the situation under control." The chief of staff looked tense but nodded in understanding. "The president will want assurances that we're prepared for any escalation. We can't afford to look unprepared in the eyes of our allies or adversaries." Ayanna's expression remained calm. "I understand, and I can assure you that we're taking every precaution. We're already implementing defensive measures and will be ready to respond if the situation escalates further." I'll have more detailed updates for you within the hour. Uh, Thank you, General, the Chief of Staff said. We trust your judgment. Keep us informed. The call ended, and Ayanna took a moment to compose herself before returning to the briefing room. She had always known that leadership required more than just tactical expertise. It required the ability to navigate the complexities of politics, public perception, and global diplomacy. Today was no different. Back in the briefing room, the discussion had intensified. Her team had mapped out several potential responses to the threat, and Ayanna quickly brought herself up to speed on their progress. General, we've prepared a response plan that includes immediate deployment of additional forces to our vulnerable regions, one of her officers explained. We also recommend initiating cyber defense protocols to protect our communication networks from potential breaches. Ayanna nodded, her mind already processing the information. Good. Implement the cyber defense protocols immediately. I also want contingency plans in place if we need to escalate further. The room buzzed with activity as the team moved to execute her orders. Despite the tension, there was an underlying confidence in the room, a confidence that stemmed from Ayanna's leadership. She had been in high-pressure situations like this before, and her calm, decisive approach reassured her team that they were in good hands. Hours passed as they fine-tuned their strategies, making sure every detail was accounted for. Ayanna remained at the center of it all, guiding the discussions and ensuring that every decision was made with precision. By the time the briefing concluded, the team had developed a comprehensive plan to counter the threat. Ayanna signed off on the necessary authorizations, confident that they had done everything possible to prepare. As the officers began to leave the room, Ayanna stayed behind for a moment, letting the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. The situation was far from over, but she felt a sense of accomplishment knowing that her team was ready. She walked over to the large windows that overlooked the base, the sun now setting in the distance. The orange glow cast long shadows across the grounds, and Ayanna allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. It had been a long day, one that had started with a confrontation on a plane, and ended with her leading a critical briefing that could shape the future of national security. But through it all, Ayanna had remained focused, resilient, and strong. She had learned long ago that leadership wasn't just about making the right decisions. It was about maintaining your composure in the face of adversity, about knowing when to step back and let others lead, and about standing tall even when the world seemed determined to push you down. As she stood by the window, her phone buzzed one final time. It was a message from the young soldier she had met on the plane, the one who had looked up to her with such admiration. "Thank you for your words, General. You've inspired me more than you know." Ayanna smiled softly, pocketing the phone. It was moments like these that reminded her why she did what she did, why she fought, why she led, why she continued to break barriers and pave the way for those who would come after her. The day wasn't over, but Ayanna Brooks was ready for whatever came next. While General Ayanna Brooks navigated the complexities of the military briefing, the aftershocks of her earlier confrontation with Nathan still reverberated through the young flight attendant's mind. After the incident, Nathan had returned to his routine duties, but everything felt different. His thoughts kept drifting back to Ayanna, the general he had so wrongly judged, and her calm, unwavering strength. Nathan knew he had to learn from the experience. His brief encounter with Ayanna had left a deeper impact than he had expected. It wasn't just about the embarrassment of being wrong or the shame of his behavior. It was about understanding the subtle but pervasive biases that had shaped his actions, and how easily those biases could harm others. Back at the airport, a few days had passed since the flight, and Nathan found himself sitting in the airport crew lounge, staring out of the large windows as planes taxied in and out. The busy environment around him seemed at odds with his internal struggle. He couldn't shake the feeling of disappointment in himself, but more than that, he was determined to change. He replayed Ayanna's words over and over in his mind. "You judge by sight, but I've fought battles you'll never see." He had never really thought about what someone like her had been through, what it must be like to constantly be judged by appearances, even when you've risen to the top of your field. He realized now how narrow his perspective had been, and it left him feeling both humbled and motivated. As he sat there, Sarah, his colleague from the flight, walked into the lounge and sat next to him. She had noticed his quiet demeanor since the incident, and had been waiting for a moment to talk. "Still thinking about that flight?" she asked, glancing at him with a knowing look. Nathan sighed, nodding. "Yeah, it's been on my mind a lot. I keep thinking about how easily I fell into that trap, making assumptions about someone just because of how they look." Sarah crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair. "It happens more than people want to admit. But the fact that you're thinking about it and wanting to change, that's important." Nathan nodded. "I don't want to be that person, you know? The kind of person who looks at someone and makes a snap judgment. I want to be better than that." Sarah smiled softly. "Well, it sounds like you're already on your way. A lot of people wouldn't even care. They'd just brush it off. But you're taking responsibility, and that's the first step." Nathan appreciated Sarah's words, but he knew there was more to it than just feeling bad. He had to act on this realization, to actively work on undoing the prejudices he carried, whether he was aware of them or not. He wanted to learn, to grow, and most importantly, to ensure that no one else he encountered felt the way Ayanna must have felt that day. "I've been reading up on unconscious bias," Nathan said after a moment. "I realized I've never really thought about it before, but now I can't ignore it. I need to be more aware of how I treat people. Everyone, not just the people who look like they belong in first class." Sarah raised an eyebrow, impressed. "That's a good start. It takes time, though. You don't just wake up one day and suddenly become bias-free. It's something you have to work on, consciously, every day." Nathan knew she was right. He had already made a promise to himself to change, but now he needed to figure out how to put that promise into action. He didn't want his growth to be superficial. He wanted it to be meaningful, something that would affect not only how he did his job, but how he lived his life. The next flight. A few days later, Nathan was back at work, preparing for another first-class flight. This time, as he walked through the cabin, greeting passengers and helping them with their luggage, he paid close attention to how he interacted with each person. He noticed things he hadn't before. Small, subconscious judgments he had been making without realizing it. A quick glance at a person's clothes or demeanor, and his brain would jump to conclusions about who they were and what they deserved. But now, with Ayanna's words still fresh in his mind, Nathan caught himself each time. He made a conscious effort to greet every passenger with the same respect, regardless of their appearance. And with each interaction, he felt a small but significant shift in the way he approached his job. As the passengers settled into their seats, Nathan felt a sense of quiet determination. He couldn't undo what had happened on that flight with General Brooks, but he could use it as a catalyst for change. He could become the kind of person who treated everyone with the dignity they deserved, no matter their rank, race, or background. Midway through the flight, Nathan had a brief break and took the opportunity to reflect on the progress he had made. It wasn't easy to confront your own flaws, but he knew it was necessary. And in a strange way, he felt grateful for the experience with Ayanna. It had opened his eyes to a world he hadn't fully understood before. Reflection. That evening, after the flight had landed, Nathan returned home feeling both exhausted and satisfied. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. His mind wandered back to General Brooks and the impact she had unknowingly had on his life. He wondered how many other people she had inspired, how many others had learned something from her strength and resilience. She had fought battles, not just on the battlefield, but in everyday life, facing challenges that most people couldn't even begin to imagine. And yet she had carried herself with such grace, even in the face of prejudice. Nathan knew he couldn't change the world overnight, but he could change the way he interacted with it. He could choose to see people for who they were rather than what they appeared to be. And in doing so, he hoped to make the world a little better, one small interaction at a time. As he sat there, Reflecting on the journey he had been on since that fateful flight, Nathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that was enough for now. The next time he stepped onto a plane, he would do so with a clear mind and an open heart, ready to treat every passenger with the respect and dignity they deserved. The sun had begun to set as General Ayanna Brooks left the military base. The intense briefing had lasted hours, and her mind was still buzzing with the weight of the decisions that had been made. The urgency of the situation had been met with careful planning, and her team was confident in the steps they had laid out to address the imminent threat. But as always, the lingering pressure remained. There was never a guarantee that everything would go as planned. In her world, nothing was ever fully predictable. Ayanna climbed into the waiting vehicle that would take her back to her hotel for the night. The quiet hum of the car engine provided a stark contrast to the whirlwind of the day, but it allowed her a rare moment to think. The day had been long, filled with challenges that tested both her patience and her leadership. But what truly stuck in her mind wasn't the high-level military decisions or the tense negotiations. Instead, her thoughts kept drifting back to the flight, to Nathan, and to the young soldier who had quietly thanked her for her leadership. Leadership. That word had always meant more to Ayanna than just being in charge. To her, leadership wasn't just about commanding troops or making decisions in war rooms. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the world tried to diminish your value. It was about showing strength in moments of doubt, and using those moments as opportunities to teach, to guide, to inspire. She leaned her head back against the seat, staring out the window at the city lights as they blurred past. Her mind wandered to the countless battles she had fought, not just on the battlefield, but in everyday life. She thought about her early days in the military, when she had been one of only a handful of black women in her rank. She had faced skepticism from all sides, from people who thought she didn't belong, from those who questioned her abilities simply because of her appearance. And yet she had risen, not because she wanted to prove them wrong, though that had been a driving force in her early years, but because she believed in herself. She had always believed that she was meant for more, that her value wasn't tied to how others saw her. It was tied to the work she did, to the people she inspired, to the lives she saved and the missions she led. Flashback. She remembered a moment from her early career, a particularly difficult mission in the Middle East. It had been her first major deployment as a leader, and the pressure had been immense. She had been tasked with leading a convoy through hostile territory, and every decision she made could mean life or death for her troops. Some of the soldiers under her command had questioned her ability to lead, quietly behind her back. But she had known. She had felt the doubt in their eyes, the subtle hesitation in their actions. The night before the mission, Ayanna had stood outside her tent, staring up at the stars, wondering if she was truly ready. She had trained for this moment her entire life, but now that it was here, the weight of it threatened to crush her. As she stood there, lost in thought, her commanding officer, Colonel Abrams, had approached her. "You're thinking too much, Brooks," he had said, his voice gruff but kind. Ayanna had turned to him, surprised. She hadn't realized anyone else was awake. "I'm just making sure I'm prepared, sir." Colonel Abrams had chuckled softly. "You're more than prepared. You've got everything you need to lead this mission. The only thing standing in your way is your own doubt." Ayanna had frowned, unsure how to respond. "Let me tell you something," Colonel Abrams had continued, his tone growing more serious. "Leadership isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about trusting yourself, even when others don't. It's about making decisions and standing by them no matter what." Those words had stayed with her, long after the mission had ended successfully. She had led her troops through the hostile territory without a single casualty, earning their respect and proving her ability to lead under pressure. But more importantly, she had learned to trust herself, to silence the doubts that had plagued her and focus on the task at hand. Present day. Now, all these years later, Ayanna sat in the back of a quiet vehicle, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The lessons she had learned early in her career had shaped her into the leader she was today. And yet, even now, the challenges of leadership never truly went away. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen and saw a message from her aide, updating her on the situation they had discussed during the briefing. Everything was in motion. Her team was working around the clock to ensure that the necessary precautions were in place, and the military was ready to respond to any further developments. Ayana responded with a brief acknowledgement, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. She trusted her team implicitly, knowing that they would handle things while she took a few hours to rest and regroup. But even as she sent the message, her mind remained on high alert. The responsibilities of a general never truly left, even in moments of stillness. As the car approached her hotel, Ayana allowed herself one last moment of reflection. She thought again of Nathan, the flight attendant who had so quickly judged her, and of the young soldier who had looked up to her with admiration. Two very different people, both impacted by her presence in vastly different ways. Nathan's confrontation had been a reminder of the biases that still existed, even in places where they shouldn't. But it had also been a chance for him to learn, to grow. Ayana had seen the shift in him, the way he had struggled to find the right words when he realized his mistake. And she hoped, sincerely, that he would take that lesson to heart. The young soldier, on the other hand, had reminded Ayana of why she did what she did. She hadn't risen through the ranks just for herself. She had done it to show others what was possible, to inspire the next generation of leaders, to prove that anyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, could lead, could succeed, could make a difference. Leadership, Ayana knew, was about more than just making decisions. It was about lifting others up, about showing them that they had the strength within themselves to rise, even when the world tried to push them down. The car pulled up to the entrance of the hotel, and Ayana stepped out, thanking the driver before heading inside. The lobby was quiet, the polished floors reflecting the soft glow of the chandeliers above. She made her way to her room, her steps measured and purposeful, as they always were. Once inside, she sat on the edge of the bed, removing her military jacket and folding it neatly on a chair. The silence of the room felt almost foreign after the chaos of the day, but it was a welcome change. She allowed herself a brief moment of rest, her body sinking into the soft mattress as she stared up at the ceiling. Her thoughts drifted once again to the young soldier on the plane. She remembered his words, the quiet awe in his voice when he had spoken to her. "You're an inspiration to all of us," he had said. Ayana hadn't responded with anything grand, just a simple, heartfelt thanks. But those words had stayed with her. She knew that for every soldier like him, there were countless others who were watching her, looking to her for guidance, for strength. And that, more than anything, was what drove her forward. The knowledge that she wasn't just leading for herself, she was leading for them. The night was quiet, but Ayana's mind was still buzzing with thoughts of the day, of the battles she had fought, both in and out of the war room. She had faced countless challenges, many of which had nothing to do with her rank or her skills, but with the simple fact that she existed in a world that wasn't always ready to accept her. But she had persisted, she had led, and she had inspired. And as she lay there staring up at the ceiling, Ayana Brooks knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But she was ready for them, just as she had always been. For her, leadership wasn't just about the decisions she made in a briefing room. It was about the impact she left on the people she encountered, the lessons she taught without even realizing it, the quiet strength she carried with her wherever she went. She closed her eyes, letting the weight of the day finally settle. Tomorrow was another day, another battle to be fought, and General Ayana Brooks would be ready. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of General Ayana Brooks' hotel room, casting a soft glow on the neatly folded uniform she had placed on the chair the night before. Ayana sat by the window sipping a cup of coffee, her gaze focused on the distant city skyline. The events of the previous day still lingered in her mind, but today, a new sense of calm settled over her. The briefing had gone as well as could be expected, and her team was executing the plans she had laid out. For now, things were under control. But even in these moments of relative peace, Ayana knew that leadership never truly paused. The weight of her responsibilities was always present, a constant companion in her life. She took a deep breath, centering herself for the day ahead, knowing that every day brought new challenges, new decisions to be made. Her phone buzzed on the table next to her. Ayana glanced at the screen and saw a message from one of her closest advisors, updating her on the latest developments. Everything was proceeding as planned, with no new complications. It was good news, though Ayana knew better than to let her guard down completely. In her line of work, things could change in an instant. She set the phone aside, letting her thoughts drift back to the flight and to the people she had encountered along the way. Nathan, the flight attendant, and the young soldier who had looked up to her with such admiration. Their faces, their words, and the impact of those brief interactions still weighed on her. Flashback. She remembered the moment when Nathan had approached her, his voice shaky and uncertain as he apologized for his earlier behavior. Ayana could see the regret in his eyes, the internal struggle he faced as he grappled with his own biases. She had seen that look before, many times in fact, and it was always a reminder of how deeply ingrained prejudice could be, even in the most everyday interactions. But rather than meeting his apology with anger or resentment, Ayana had chosen to offer him a lesson. She had been calm, measured, and direct, knowing that in moments like this, she had the power to influence change. Nathan had made a mistake, but it was a mistake he could learn from. And in that moment, Ayana had seen a flicker of understanding in him, a realization that he could be better. Now, sitting by the window in her hotel room, Ayana couldn't help but wonder what had become of Nathan. Had he truly taken her words to heart? Had he reflected on the experience and made a conscious effort to change? Ayana liked to believe that he had. She had learned long ago that while you couldn't control how others treated you, you could control how you responded. And sometimes, that response had the power to shift someone's entire perspective. Leadership wasn't just about commanding respect or making decisions in high-pressure situations. It was about using every opportunity, no matter how small, to leave a lasting impact. And Ayana had come to understand that the most powerful lessons were often taught in the quiet moments, the moments where you showed people a better way. At the airport, meanwhile, Nathan was working another shift at the airport. As he moved through the cabin, helping passengers find their seats and ensuring everything was in order, his thoughts kept drifting back to General Brooks. Since their encounter, Nathan had felt a change in himself, a shift in how he approached his job, his interactions with passengers, and even his own inner thoughts. He had started paying closer attention to the way he treated people, making sure to greet everyone with the same level of respect, regardless of their appearance. He had even enrolled in a training session on unconscious bias, determined to become more aware of the subtle judgments he made without realizing it. It wasn't an easy process, but Nathan was committed to becoming better, to learning from his mistakes. As he handed a passenger their boarding pass, Nathan smiled, thinking back to General Brooks' quiet strength. She had handled the situation with such grace, and her words had stuck with him long after the flight had ended. She hadn't needed to shout or demand respect. Her presence alone commanded it. And in that moment, Nathan realized that true power didn't come from authority or position. It came from how you treated others. As the flight took off and the plane ascended into the sky, Nathan felt a sense of pride in the progress he had made. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that, he knew, was the first step. Present day. Back in Washington, Ayana received an update from her aide. The situation she had been monitoring had stabilized. The military's swift response, guided by her leadership, had prevented any further escalation, and the threat had been neutralized. For now, the crisis was over. Ayana allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, knowing that her team's hard work had paid off. But even in victory, there was always more to be done. There were always new challenges on the horizon, new battles to fight, both on the battlefield and in everyday life. She stood up, preparing for the day ahead. Her uniform, neatly pressed and ready, hung on the chair beside her bed. As she reached for it, She paused for a moment, reflecting on everything that had led her to this point. The lessons she had learned, the challenges she had faced, and the people who had shaped her journey. Leadership wasn't easy. It was a constant balancing act between strength and compassion, between decisiveness and patience. But Ayanna had learned to embrace the complexity of it. She had learned that true leadership wasn't just about being in command. It was about lifting others up, about inspiring those around you to be better, to do better. As she put on her uniform, Ayanna smiled softly to herself. She was ready for whatever came next. Closing reflection? In the days that followed, Ayanna continued to reflect on the events of the past week. She thought of Nathan and the young soldier, of the military briefing that had tested her leadership, and of the quiet moments of reflection that had grounded her. Each experience, in its own way, had reinforced the lessons she had carried with her throughout her career. And as she stood at the window of her office, overlooking the city below, Ayanna knew one thing for certain. Leadership wasn't about the title or the rank. It was about the impact you had on the people around you, the way you inspired them to rise to their potential, and the legacy you left behind. For General Ayanna Brooks, that legacy was one of strength, resilience, and grace under pressure. And as she prepared for the challenges that lay ahead, she knew that she was ready, because leadership at its core was about never giving up, no matter how many battles you had to fight.